Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Okay, let's go into their names. I'm Paul.
Douglas.
Aaron.
Bob.
Paul.
Baruch.
Carl.
Patrick.
Marvin.
Todd. Remy.
Sambo.
Marshall.
Lucas.
Kay.
Anthony.
Richard.
Peter.
Jim.
Don.
Ray. Steve. Peter. Jim. Jonathan.
Jim. John. David.
Milam. Gary. Michael. Mark. Jay.
Is anybody here for the first time? What was your name again?
Milam.
Milam, welcome. And, oh yeah, what was your name again?
Marshall.
Marshall. Our speaker today is Padmadharini. Did I pronounce that right?
Actually, it's Padmadharini.
Yeah. Isn't that what I said? She has practiced in the tradition of the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order since 1989 and was ordained into the Western Buddhist Order in 2004. Excuse me. Originally from England, she has been in the Bay Area for 9 years, where she works in public policy. She's actively involved in the spiritual direction of the San Francisco Buddhist Center, that would be here, where she teaches meditation and leads Dharma courses. She has a particular interest in using Buddhism to understand and work with depression, and is currently writing a book on this topic. She brings to her teaching an engagement in social issues, including what it means to live in urban situations and practice wholeheartedly. I don't know what this is. The word. Lord knows what she's going to speak on today. So
Well, I'll start by telling you I'm going to talk today, broadly speaking, on the subject of renunciation. As you can tell, I'm obviously practicing as a renunciant. I only get my hair dyed every month as opposed to every other month. I try to only shop every other week as opposed to every week. But I'm going to frame it in a context, or at least kind of refer to addiction, because I know there's been some, sort of having some talks on those subjects. So I'm not an expert on addiction. I certainly have addictions, but you'll see as I go into this. But so I'm also going to talk a little bit about an experience of renunciation that I'm sort of in the process of myself, and sort of so some personal reference to those experiences. And I should start by saying anybody who's come here and heard me talk, or heard me talk in other contexts, my favorite teaching, and actually I see it as being sort of really the principal teaching in Buddhism, is the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. So everything I kind of do in my practice, everything I try to exemplify in my practice, and therefore we'll talk about today, is really kind of coming from the basis of understanding at a fundamental level the inevitability of suffering. Not that everything in life is suffering, but that we can't avoid a certain amount of suffering and unpleasantness in life. In fact, I was just on the phone to a friend this morning before I came here. An old friend of mine in England had just died this last week. She's my age, she's 43, and she was diagnosed with cancer about a year ago. So it's kind of, I'm very present to this subject matter right now, that death in a way is the ultimate form of kind of suffering, or it's the most sort of inevitable thing that will happen to all of us, and yet my friend and I were just kind of reflecting on how easy it is to, we're both sort of still in shock really about Ruth dying, just feeling that, 43-year-old woman, it's just not fair, and then realizing, well, it's there's no fairness about it. It's just, it happens. So I'm going to talk today about this subject of renunciation, and I know you're having some other talks, or you've been having talks on addiction. So I want to kind of say a little bit about how I think renunciation is actually really linked to addiction, but not necessarily in the way that you might think. So I'm not going to be talking about this sort of idea of in a sort of extreme way of having to give up things. So I thought it was interesting. I just looked up, I was talking to a friend of mine about addiction, and we were sort of, thinking about how often when we think of addiction, we really tend to think about sort of chemical addictions, or I think we're also very fond of vilifying certain kinds of addiction and only focusing on those. But actually when I looked up addiction in a dictionary, it describes it as a condition of being habitually or compulsively occupied with or involved in something. So again, it's described as a condition of being habitually or compulsively occupied with or involved in something. So it encompasses chemical addictions. But I think there's just a way in which, especially in this culture, we like to kind of focus in on, it's like how California is so fond of sin taxes. In fact, I've worked for 5 years for an organization called First Five, which is actually funded through tobacco taxation. So, we're very fond of kind of focusing on those kind of addictions. But what about sort of the compulsions and addictions that are socially acceptable? The example that just immediately comes to my mind is work addiction, actually, which I think I'm somewhat addicted to work. I was listening on NPR radio, I think it was Wednesday. They were talking about this study that's just been released that says that, and it's looking at middle-aged English people versus middle-aged Americans, saying that actually English people are generally healthier, which I think was sort of quite shocking was shocking to me. And then they were interviewing various English people who've lived here for a long time. They had this one Scottish guy on there, and they were sort of asking him what he thought of this, and he says, they just need to have less stress. They need to chill out. And I thought, well, this is the fact of American life. And actually what's interesting is British life is becoming more and more that way. It's like we're picking up this bad habit of American culture of being work addicted and moving away from a culture in which what's important actually is having having work-life balance. So I want to really put addiction in a dharmic context so that we don't focus so much on the substance of what it is that we might be addicted to or have been addicted to, but the nature of addiction itself. And in that sense, going back to sort of my love of the Four Noble Truths, I think it very much equates with the second of the Four Noble Truths. So is there anyone here who has no familiarity with the teaching of the Four Noble Truths? So in basically, put simply, the first noble truth is the truth of suffering. So it's really kind of, the best way I've heard it described is to say that the way into the Dharma, the way into Buddhism, is through that doorway. So in some ways, it's either through a connection with, an experience of, or an acceptance in some ways of the inevitability of suffering, or that we really kind of allow ourselves to kind of acknowledge that experience is kind of always to some degree inevitable. Again, important that it's not saying that there isn't joy and happiness that's also present in life, but that unpleasantness will come and it will go. And then the second noble truth is the truth of the cause of that suffering. And in Buddhism there are traditionally two ways. The cause is either seen as ignorance, so it's the ignorance of the true nature of reality. It's the ignorance that is expressed in addiction, you could say. And then it's also expressed as what are called defiled emotions. So, typically we see those as greed, hatred, and delusion. Third noble truth is the cessation of suffering. So the good news is, suffering is inevitable, but the Buddha also said suffering, there is a way to cease suffering. And then the fourth noble truth is the path to the cessation of suffering, which, interestingly enough, comes through the practice of learning how to kind of be more present with suffering. So in the second of these noble truths, the cause of suffering, traditionally we're talking about, what causes our suffering is craving happiness or craving pleasure, or aversion to what is unpleasant. So in some ways we could see that as a kind of in some ways that describes what happens when we're addicted to things. We want pleasure, we seek pleasure, we get drawn into pleasure, and then at some point we become addicted to whatever that form of pleasure is. So Buddhism views human psychology as being mostly driven by two innate impulses, desire or attraction or craving, and then on the other hand there's repulsion or aversion to things. And it stems from basically this desire to have things that will make us happy, that will distract us from suffering and pain. And these things are often habitual, and most the ones that are kind of most obvious to us are the easy ones in some ways. It's the ones that kind of float or fly under the radar that I think are the sort of more dangerous ones. So it's those things we do day to day, and they're often done at a really unconscious level. They're the things we do to help us rise above the kind of injustices and irritations that kind of assail us on a day-to-day basis. So perhaps we kind of drink to help to numb feelings. We get home at the end of the day and we're kind of stressed out. We think, I'll just have a drink, it'll just make me feel better. Or we smoke. What's interesting about chemical addiction that I find really fascinating is that all of those substances that many of us get addicted to are immediately satisfying. They do immediately bring benefit. So smoking, for example, immediately, and there's been research to show this, it reduces stress. So when you're stressed and you smoke a cigarette, it does actually reduce your stress immediately. So it's important, I think that's an important thing to kind of keep in touch with. People don't do the things they do because they're thinking, I think I really want to kind of, shorten my lifespan and one day die of lung cancer, so I'm going to light up this cigarette. We smoke because right then it makes us feel good. So perhaps we work long hours because it keeps us busy, because it brings in the money, so that we can feed our addiction to sensory pleasure. We can buy those clothes, or we can go to Restoration Hardware and buy that piece of furniture that we really don't need, but is going to look nice in our new apartment. It's basically all compulsive and habitual. If we really look at how often we go out and we do those things in a sort of conscious, aware, present way. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this in terms of my own experience. The other thing about addiction, I think, whatever it is we're addicted to, is it rewards our sense of identity in a way. So when we indulge in what we crave, it's sort of giving us a sense of ourselves, even when some of those addictions are not good for us, and even though we might in our mind think, I really want to stop doing this. Often it's really tied into our sense of identity, and I think it's very kind of clear to me when I think about sort of image, and you only have to sort of walk through the Castro to see that kind of very present. The gyms are there, and the kind of the bodies walking down the street that are well toned and look good, and you can see that that's kind of all part of maintaining a sense of self and an image. So that's the other kind of piece of it, is it really holds in place this security that we want to kind of cling on to, that says I am permanent and I am substantial and there is this self. So that's the other kind of way to link this into kind of the Buddha's teaching, is that ultimately in the cessation of suffering, what we have to face is the emptiness of self, the emptiness of all reality. But the more we kind of cling on to even having the nice apartment with the nice things in it, or having the wardrobe full of nice clothes, that's all part of kind of maintaining an identity. And I want to sort of put forward an important caveat. I'm not speaking as someone who has gone forth from these things. I still have, I'm still quite attached to having a nice wardrobe, and I still haven't yet managed to kind of let my grey hair grow out. So there's still ways in which I'm quite strongly kind of hooked into my identity of being sort of somewhat trendy, and so there's, I'm coming from a place of understanding what it is to be addicted to these things. So in Buddhism, the fourth noble truth, and it's translated in different ways, but one sort of very common translation of the path that leads to the cessation of suffering is the path of renunciation. And that's why traditionally and historically in Buddhism you see monks and nuns who've literally, they are renunciants. They have gone forth from all forms of worldly pleasure. They shave their head as a symbol of no longer kind of being attached to appearance. They have no belongings. So you see traditionally the Buddha had his bowl, and that's even a symbol of going forth, because the Buddha and the monks and nuns would rely on the generosity of the community to feed them even. They would have one robe, a very simple robe, and that's what. And actually, if you really kind of bring to mind an image of the Buddha wandering around back in the day, he would have probably looked, he'd have had stubble and he'd have been kind of dirty and dusty, and so there isn't this, there's really kind of a sense of that idea of letting go of everything that kind of gives us that sense of self and that sense of identity. So renunciation, for us though, doesn't necessarily refer to something quite that extreme. As was mentioned in my introduction, I have sort of practiced as a Buddhist over the years, and I was ordained as a Buddhist in an urban situation. I have a job, I owned a home. So we're also kind of trying to look for that spirit of renunciation and not sort of just as it's seen in the homeless life, or the life of being a monk or a nun. So in this sense, I think renunciation for me is very much about developing an attitude of non-attachment. And that really arises for me in adopting a long-term perspective. So rather than responding to our kind of spontaneous impulses, we actually kind of, or even our sort of fears, or the short-term benefit that might come from, doing a particular something or purchasing a particular something, we start to kind of look beyond those short-term benefits, and we take a broader perspective. We begin to look beyond even our own personal benefits. So you can see in respect of many of the things, belongings are a good example. The addiction that we have, compulsion we have in this culture to purchase and own things. How much, you don't have to sort of do much reading or reflection to see the sort of terrible impact that's had on the planet, and that it increases to have a terrible, even just the large cars that we drive, we can see how that kind of consumerism, if we take a bigger perspective, if we look beyond this moment, we look beyond ourselves, we can see the kind of impact that kind of behavior is having. So renunciation, it can't just be, but on the other hand, renunciation cannot just be about being sort of fed up or depressed. The Buddha, when he went forth, so you have that sort of story of the Buddha leaving his wife, his child. He didn't leave because he was like cheesed off with married life. It wasn't like, I'm really done with this. I'm really sick of being a dad. I don't want to have this responsibility. He left because he was responding to a very deep impulse. A deep spiritual impulse. So renunciation is also about responding to something deep in ourselves. It's sort of it's that kind of deep intuition. I don't know how many of you can relate to this, but I know for myself, I've gone through phases in my 20s. I was certainly kind of addicted to a lot of drugs. I was taking drugs, I was going out clubbing, drinking, had lots of sexual partners. That was a phase in my life when that made me feel good, and it fed my kind of sense of self. But I remember very clearly there came a point when it wasn't kind of satisfying me anymore, and it just started to kind of feel really sort of empty. It's interesting. I met up with a friend on Friday evening at Majul, which is this new place that's opened up back here. She had just got married, so she was having a kind of a gathering. And I just was kind of in there for like 3 hours and just watching the kind of parade of people, and lots of people who are drunk, and just sort of like having this sense of like, wow, I can see it now and experience it, and actually not coming from a place of judgment, not coming from a place of I can't believe these young people today, but just a sense of like this, I can't relate to this anymore. Like it doesn't, I can't imagine how that would bring me pleasure in the way that it used to. But it did used to bring me pleasure, and then came that moment. I had a very, very similar experience in terms of this life that I have been living, which interestingly I can now see that there's not really that much difference between me sort of a year ago owning this house, a slave to the mortgage, having to kind of, keep up this high-paying professional job in order to pay my mortgage, really. And same difference, really, just this addiction to kind of having a particular social status, actually, and having a reputation, like seeing that I was quite addicted to kind of recognition and professional recognition, and that somehow that was keeping me trapped in this kind of lifestyle that I kept moaning about. I kept saying to my friends, I can't believe I work so hard, I can't believe I'm doing these 50-hour weeks, I never have enough time to really kind of devote to Buddhist Center, and that's really what I care about. So listening to this sort of like record playing in my head over and over, but yet seeing somehow that I was making a choice to live my life in a particular way. So it was kind of this same realization, like coming to this place of thinking, it's not doing it anymore. Like, it's that in a way. It's a very, very deep sense of just when you come to that place where you just are on that edge of, it's not fulfilling me. And it's really about responding to that. It's when that sort of voice starts to kind of emerge that you don't just push it to one side and continue to do whatever it is you're addicted to, but you listen to that voice. You listen to that kind of tiny, sometimes it's just a little kind of whisper that tells us somewhere in the depth of our being that I don't want to be doing this. And it's always, in my experience, it's always kind of going to be in battle with that part of you that kind of really wants the pleasure that those addictions bring. So it's kind of it's two things sort of coming up against each other. So although renunciation traditionally is described as this sort of act, as the Buddha did, of giving up the home life, so that's really kind of traditionally what we're talking about, it's clear that this can be a good model, I think, or a useful illustration of a state of mind and realization. So it's a state of mind in which you say, this isn't it. In a way, that was what the Buddha was responding to. It was just this very deep sense he had of this is not ultimately going to bring me true joy and true happiness, because this life that I'm living is conditioned. So it's fundamentally about letting go of the hankering that we have for happiness, the sort of the addiction that we have to being happy all the time. The best way I've kind of heard this described as a practice is it's being willing to face the desolation of nowhere. Or in other words, it's being willing to stand and face kind of disappointment, and the disappointment that's sort of implicit in some ways in life sometimes. Or another way is like thinking of it as that dark night of the soul. I know for myself when I've had to kind of really work with an addiction, especially, and I have had to work with chemical addiction, there's a point at which you have to go through that dark night of the soul. You have to be willing to face your fears. You have to be willing to experience what's kind of really underneath there that you're trying to escape from. And in a way, it's not. It's a bit like my talking about my friend at the beginning. At a really deep level, I see this as the same thing as sort of turning towards death and turning towards the inevitability of death. You realize that there aren't any cozy corners. There actually are, which is not, in fact, to say that kind of life sucks and life's terrible and everything is suffering, but it's to say that along the way there will just be moments, there will be times. And the more that we can the more we're capable of dealing with what's uncomfortable, it's said that the more we will be prepared when that sort of when that moment arrives. Pema Chodron has this great thing. She talks about practicing with the small stuff. Like, she makes this point, don't wait until you've got to face that huge kind of thing in your life. You know, start with the small stuff. Start with that sort of like impulse that you have to go shopping on the weekend. It's like, you know, IKEA is over there calling restoration hardware. And you're like, you've nothing to do, you're sitting around, you feel that kind of sense of boredom. It's like, oh, I'll go to IKEA or I'll go clothes shopping. It's like you can start with that. You can just choose for one time to not follow that impulse and just stay with whatever that kind of slight uncomfortableness is that's underneath. I remember a few years back, or 3 years ago, I did my first kind of long solitary retreat. I did a month. And I decided to sort of go on this retreat and not, usually I would go on a solitary and I'd take something to study, and I just thought, I'm not going to read on this retreat. I took a couple of books, a devotional text, and I took a text that I could like, a meditation text. So I sort of went for a month without anything to distract myself. And there were times on that retreat when I thought I was going crazy. I am a busy gal, let me tell you. I am constantly in motion doing. So here I was for a month and I had nothing to do. I noticed that I managed to get myself a schedule of meditation. So that, you know, my morning was like meditate for like 5 or 6 hours, and then I'd go on my hike, and then I'd come back and I'd try and find something else to do. And so it was kind of interesting to watch that addiction playing itself out in this beautiful place, and the times that I would just sit there and feel just this intense kind of uncomfortableness, and how this restlessness was kind of driving me to do. Trungpa talks about, you know, learning to kind of be with boredom. He says boredom is kind of, you know, is real. If we can really kind of learn to kind of sit with our boredom. So it's that practice of just sitting with yourself a little bit more, sitting with what's kind of the restlessness, the discomfort, and not kind of going to that thing that we do to escape from that place. And ultimately, I think it really is, there's that wonderful line from William Blake, "He who binds himself to a joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise." So it's this idea of like, if you can just really allow joy when it comes into your life to just be, and not try and like grab it and hold on to it, but just allow it to be. And it's exactly the same principle with things that are unpleasant. Actually, the more you learn to kind of let unpleasantness be, the more you realize that it comes and it goes. What holds it in place, what keeps unpleasantness kind of there is the aversion, ironically, is the resistance to it. So the more we resist unpleasantness, the more we kind of fix it. So it's just this kind of process. I mean, to me, all practice is fundamentally about how do we learn to just be with our experience and let things be. And I think it's about facing that fear that we probably all have of disappointment and failure. So I want, in this respect, I just sort of really want to talk a little bit about my own experience about, so I've described a little bit about my life. I have a very, well-paid job. Work in the public sector. In policy, I'm a consultant. I make good money. I have a, good reputation. And I get lots of recognition from my career. I also, bought a house a few years back, so I'm making this money. It's all going into this house. And I'm, all my spare time is, the DIY. I think I sort of feel like I lived at Home Depot, and, now I can't even drive past, I have to sort of speed past Home Depot. It's like, I have an aversion to Home Depot now. So 2 years ago, I was ordained at a retreat in Italy. It was a 2-month-long retreat. And, the retreat is really all about giving those of us who are getting ordained an experience of going forth. Temporary experience. And I remember coming back from that retreat, and the same when I did that long solitary, and although there'd been quite a lot of discomfort to experience on those retreats, there was, something happened for me in those places where I kind of found this depth that was just very joyful, a sort of depth of experience that I don't experience in my life. And it wasn't dependent on anything. Wasn't dependent on shopping or being busy or recognition. It was just there. And then, of course, I came back after my ordination, and I'm immediately kind of back at my job, back in my crazy busy life, and having that record going on, saying, why is my life so busy, and when's it going to stop being busy, and when am I going to have the space to really practice? So in September this last September, I went back to England. I went on a retreat and connected, and actually my partner lives at this retreat center. She's the chairwoman at this retreat center, and she's about the same age as me. She has she has less than $1,000 in the bank anyway, is all I know. She gets support at the retreat, so I think they get about $60 a week or something. She has this one little room with all her stuff in that room, which is not very much. I mean, I'm constantly amazed at how little stuff she has. She bought herself this new suitcase, and she doesn't have enough clothes to fill the suitcase. I'm always trying to get myself to fit things in a little suitcase, which is pretty funny. But and I just being around her and other friends of mine over there that are kind of working in the movement over there. I suppose this time I was just very struck by the fact that she's just very content. There's not a lot of craving going on there. There's not a lot of I want. And here's some, she has no pension, no security, just, and yet there's no fear. There's not a lot of anxiety. And I have a pension, I have, property, and I'm anxious. I'm thinking, no, I mean not all the time, but there's definitely that anxiety is sort of in me. And so and they were talking. We bought some land a few years ago in the movement in Spain, to build a women's retreat center for women preparing for ordination. We've had one for the men for some years, so it's been a goal to set this up for women. So they bought this land and they've set up a community there, and they're all the time looking for people that are willing to go and live there. So there I was in September. They were talking about it, and I said, I'm going to go for a year. And so I came back and I sold my house and I quit my job. I'm finishing out some consulting work now, and a few people have sort of asked me recently, well, what made you decide? And I think, I don't know. I think, and I go back to that thing I was talking about, the instinct. There was just I lived with that feeling of looking at my life and thinking, this is not it. This isn't it. This kind of, so-called perfect life that I'm living with the, six-figure salary and the house in California, this is not really what I want, or it's not really fulfilling that deeper urge. And it's been interesting sort of going through the process, because as I've sort of sold my house, and I've also made this commitment to not get into doing anything with this money, I have these, I notice myself, sometimes I'll be sitting at my computer and I'll have this urge to start looking at properties or, going on sort of investment websites, because it's I should be doing something with my money. And I've just sort of decided to let go for this period of a year and a half. In September, I'm going to go off and live for a little over a year at this place in Spain. And I'm going to something where, let me tell you, my skill sets are not set up for this place is in the middle of nowhere. I just went out to visit. It's in this kind of, we call it the rocky outcropping. It's off the grid, everything. It's all about, how they can are they going to have enough water to get through the summer? They have, the house is freezing in the winter. So it's going to challenge me. And the work is about, rolling up your sleeves and getting out there and helping to build or, whatever needs doing. So it's certainly not going to be some high profile, high powered thing. It's just going to be about doing things that I'm not very confident that I can do. So it's really revealing sort of insecurities, So already I've kind of come up against a certain amount of fear as I sold my house. I just gave everything away. People, I didn't hang on to anything. I thought, I really don't want to have all this furniture in storage as a kind of, a burden around my neck, or a feeling of now I have to get another property. I just gave it all away. I'm now in one room renting from a couple of friends of mine, and it's great. There's a part of me that just is feeling so liberated. I don't have this burden. And at the same time, I'm realizing that that's what is so, in a way, it's kind of what's challenging about renunciation or giving something up. It's when we decide we're going to give up an addiction. You have to be willing to kind of face whatever it is that addiction was kind of keeping at bay. So for me, it's been about, really facing kind of my insecurities about my identity and coming to this place of like, well, who am I? And in a way, I'm not anybody, but so much of my identity has been about success. So now it's like just really letting myself face what it means to just be a human being, living out in the middle of nowhere. And it's been, even just the experience of those moments when I feel sort of anxiety, which I've had quite a lot of those moments, just will just arise in me. And then just, again, bringing that practice of letting that sense of anxiety, just giving it space, giving it room, not trying to fix it or do anything with it. Not trying to fix it by thinking I should be doing something with my money. Had dinner with a couple of friends of mine who are just buying a property in Spain. So they're kind of on the opposite. They're doing the things that I felt like I should be doing. And he's busy telling me, well, the dollar's like crashing against everything. You need to get you need to get all your money out of dollars. You need to invest it in this. You need to get it. So the whole evening's about him advising me. And that night I noticed that I had all this anxiety, and I woke up the next morning and I was like, so I go on the website and then I just was like, Padmadharini, you decided you were not going to do this. Just let yourself feel the anxiety. It's fine. Just experience that this is a certain amount of anxiety in this. So it's not like I have any kind of point to tell you that, I've had some huge realization from this experience. To date, what I'm having is a lot of kind of mini realizations about myself and about what it is that I'm addicted to, and really facing that busyness addiction, actually. And just beginning to sort of see myself on the edge of this experience, and what is it going to take me as I move through this next 18 months to continue to live by that promise that I've made to myself that I'm not going to do anything, I'm not going to plan anything, I'm not going to try and sort of fix my life out for 18 months, and try and start figuring out what job I'm going to have, but just see what emerges. It's this opportunity to see what will come through when I'm not so fixed into, a sense of my identity being this. And I think what that takes is really being willing to sort of let go of who I think I am, and just, see what emerges in that. So I think, in a way, I just wanted to give that personal experience as an example of, like, for me, fundamentally, I think renunciation, in a really deep sense, is about renouncing that kind of fixed sense of self or of others that we have. In a way, so how we view ourselves and how we view other or the world are very interdependent. Our emotional responses to the world outside of us strengthen our sense of self, and our sense of self tend to create our sense of other. So in a way, my being sort of locked into this kind of way of life has really created my kind of sense of how I see others. So, it's going to be interesting for me to kind of like shake up my own identity and see how that shakes up my experience of the world. So I think when we do allow ourselves to let go of things, and again, I want to go back to, Pema Chodron's sense, like, start with the small stuff. Don't go out and tackle the kind of huge, like, addiction that you have. Like, I have still not tackled my addiction to clothes. I do have quite, I just love clothes. And, I've come up with all sorts of rationalizations. I tend to shop in thrift stores, it's like, I have all these, like, good. But what's been interesting is since I sold my house, I haven't wanted to shop. Like, something like a natural thing has just come out of this process where I'm like, I'm really not that interested in shopping. Like, I've tried a couple of times. I can't shop anymore. Terrible. So you can see, like, what is it about your identity that you're hanging on to? What is it? Like, even if what you're addicted to, if what you're addicted to is sex, if what you're addicted to is, clubbing, going out and doing the drugs and things, what is it? Or even, purchasing nice things for your home. What is it that you're holding on to? So for me, it's about worldly success and recognition. For you, it might be about, status and, being seen to be somebody in your community. The truth is, it's like even with our bodies, I've been sort of blessed in this life to have, a pretty good body and, but I'm getting old, and I tell you, so it's beginning to sag, it's beginning to like get grey, and part of me still, I can see there's that, I'm still trying to hang on a little bit to like, really great. But at some point, you got to let go. Or it will let go of you. So, so for me, I can't. It's like learning. I've made. And the other thing I would say is that it can be a good thing to make decisions to really kind of give something up. Like you've got to be careful that you don't kind of do that whole grey thing of like, oh, I don't really need to give it up. For me, I really did need to sell my house. I was kind of contemplating at first renting it out, and I thought, Padmadharini, you just got to let it all go. So, it goes back to what I was saying about that sort of deeper spiritual urge. Finding something that we can actually trust. And the only thing in Buddhism we say, the only true refuge, the only thing that we can trust are, the Buddha refuge, the Dharma refuge, and the Sangha refuge. These are the things that we can hold on to. We can look to this community and say, in this I have a true refuge. In clothes and furniture and a nice car, really those refuges will, and even in our body, these things will cease at some point. So, thank you. Yes.
My addiction is to suffering.
Say that again.
My addiction is to suffering.
Huh.
And so it has been. And I've renunciated, changed my life, and find myself still suffering when there's nothing to suffer about, so to speak. In an objective sense. Suffering, yes, because I'm getting really pretty ill.
Yeah.
Really, it's not so bad.
Yeah. Well, and actually you're making a very good point that one can be addicted to suffering. I can completely relate. For a long time I hung on to this idea of like, my life's terrible, it's worse than everybody else's, nobody understands. And Buddhism isn't saying that we have to get all kind of, into our suffering. It's saying when things are unpleasant, give it room. But when things are pleasant, we also need to give that room too. So, yeah, it's a good point.
Thank you. You've been talking about property ownership, and I'm interested that your order buys property.
Yeah.
And I admire that. I think it's important and forward-looking, but I'm wondering if you could share the experience of the good, the bad, and the ugly of when a Buddhist group owns property. Because we don't, and we kind of have the luxury of not our issue.
Yeah.
But I think it is a growing issue for how we would do that, and how does it affect practice? It kind of contradicts so much of what Buddhism would say.
Yeah, well, I think it's clearly an area. You only have to look across some of the Buddhist movements to some of the issues that have come up around that very issue. In the FWBO, from the very beginning, the thing is nobody. It's kind of an interesting thing. The FWBO doesn't exist as an entity. It's a collection of people, of individuals. So, for example, here in San Francisco, certain individuals sort of came across the teaching, got very engaged, and then started to have meetings. This property was purchased, I think 3 or 4 people raised the mortgage, but it's not their property, so they don't own it, they don't get any personal gain from it. So that's kind of in this, like the center that I'm going to live at was purchased through one woman's efforts, really. She's worked on this for 6 years, and it's all done through fundraising. So the property is purchased through people's donations. So nobody owns the property; it's collectively owned. But you're right. It is a very tricky area. I mean, I think it can get into some. We have here in the U.S. had one of our centers where 2 people purchased the property, on behalf of the community, and then one of those order members later on got very, very sick, and at some point he wanted the profit, and it kind of caused a huge rift in that sangha. So, yeah.
So, thank you. Yeah, you got me reflecting on your personal process in terms of your sense of identity, and also your process in terms of a collective process with this Sangha that you're going to be joining too. And that's got me reflecting on, well, the Sangha is going to have more of an impact on your life, right? And so what is that going to do to your sense of identity as you identify more with the Sangha? And then there's this questions about ownership. And, it's just a very interesting process. And then I guess, how do you not become too attached to your sense of identity as being part of this Sangha? Right? Or how does the Sangha not become too attached to their identity of who they are?
Right. Yeah.
Or even how does the Sangha form an identity of who they are?
I mean, it's interesting. One thing I would say, and it probably wasn't clear from my talk, I'm certainly not kind of saying that owning property is a bad thing. And that's not really what my process has been about. I think the letting go of property was because it symbolized kind of a certain lifestyle that I was locked into. I think the other piece for me is that I think for me, and this is very personal, practice is always for me about how do you move away from kind of selfishness, which we're all kind of ultimately and fundamentally selfish, towards a more altruistic. And I think this goes beyond Buddhism. I think it's about having a sort of social awareness of how to live in the world. How do we live in a world in a way that's more aware of collective responsibility? So I think that there can be an opportunity when you kind of move into Sangha to sort of do that more. And there are people in the FWBO over the years who've given their whole lives to the movement. And like my partner, she doesn't get any personal gain from what she does. When she was 21, she came into the movement, and all she's done for the last almost 20 years of her life is live in communities and work for the good of the movement. So to me, that's about living an altruistic life. But I don't think everybody has to do that. It's about finding what's right for you in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear about your old friend's death. In my life, that's been the hardest thing. And this question about identity, who do you think she is? Do you have a sense of her identity? I mean, my identity is murky to me, but it's not to people who've known me my whole life.
Yeah.
And I certainly feel like I know people very well who I've known a long time.
Yeah.
Do you see what?
I do. I mean, I think it's interesting that, of course, I can say I do have a strong sense of Ruth and who I think she is, but I'm also aware, in all the years that I've practiced, I think one thing that's happened for me is gradually, I think it's eroded my confidence in, who I think I am or who I think anybody is. So even though sometimes I have absolute conviction that I think I know who Ruth is or I think I know who I am, I've practiced long enough now to know that conviction is also an illusion. That certainly if I were to bring into this room a group of people that know me, you'd get sort of a lot of agreement about who Padmadharini is. But each of those people does experience me differently. And I think that at a fundamental level, that's kind of where we're trying to move to in Buddhism, is a sense that actually everything is ultimately kind of constantly changing. I mean, I think it's Suzuki Roshi says that about, he has summed up Buddhism, the whole of Buddhism, he said, is about accepting that everything changes.
But cannot something that changed still have identity?
Well, it can and it does, but whether or not that's about attachment, to me, and actually it's not, I don't think that as one kind of moves towards a more awakened state, that means that you don't have a personality. I mean, you only have to look at some of the kind of great teachers, like Trungpa for me is a good example. I mean, the guy had a personality, and then quite a strong identity, but there's also in what you read from him, there's a sense of he's not so kind of limited by that identity. Perhaps that's... So, I think you're right. Of course there's a sense of identity, but are we sort of trapped by it or limited by it, maybe?
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I have had a lot of difficulty with this particular Sangha that we're in here for about 4 years, stemming from an incident that happened. but I've stuck it out. And, so this place of refuge, which I've been at for 16 years, the last 4 years has been very difficult for me to come to. And yet I come pretty much every week.
Yeah. Well, one thing I would say, and I mean this may not be easy to hear. I think back over my life, and I was just having this really amazing conversation with my mum yesterday about this. And this goes back to this first noble truth, and it's kind of interesting. Stuff happens. Stuff has happened in just because we're here, and there's some great stuff in this community, but there's also been crap that's happened over the years and continues to happen. And in the FWBO as a wider movement, there was a huge sort of scandal that came out 4 or 5 years ago that hit the front page newspapers in Britain and had major repercussions, still are in a way. But at the bottom line of it all, it's like this teaching that says, can we sort of like be with that things don't always go the way we want them to go. Now there's a separate issue which I can't get into with you as to whether or not sometimes things need some resolution. So that you have to sort of address in your community. But what I can say back to you is, in practice, there's this way that we have to sort of sit with, and that is a practice of renunciation in a way. We renounce the idea that everything has a resolution. Because
I'm
I'm
working on it. That's the bigger teaching for me. I'm part of a larger Sangha, the Sangha of the world, and this one I really would like, but I'm getting late onset codependency. I don't have it from my family of origin, but I'm getting it from trying to make this work here, and I'm about ready to give up.
Well, and the other thing I would speak to is, an appreciation of what you're saying about when you stick with something, even though it's difficult. I mean, that is also an expression of a practice, in a way, of renunciation in a different way. It's like when we stay with something when it's uncomfortable. And
this has been very helpful just to speak. I saw Daniel Ellsberg, who was the whistleblower for the Pentagon Papers that tells us out of Vietnam, and he inspired me to talk today.
Yeah.
So I'm just speaking, and I've got my freedom of speech back.
Yeah.
Today.
One more question. Could you give us a few words about the tension that exists between renunciation and engagement?
Well, I think, I mean, this is kind of not necessarily come from a particularly Buddhist perspective, but personally, I think that that tension exists in how we sort of live in an urban situation. This in the modern day, there was a book that was written, I think it's called Buddhist Saints in India, that kind of talks about the historic history of the Buddhist movement and how historically Buddhism, you had these forest renunciants that went out and lived in the forest, and then you had the monks and the nuns, but actually the way that it was practiced back then, we can't really practice it in the West in that way. It's not possible. And there have been communities that have tried. There's a guy in I think New York who sort of has this thing of like going out and living the homeless life, but it's really not possible. So what we have to do is try and find a balance of how do we stay in this world and engaged, but trying to be aware of where we can still practice renunciation. It's very possible to live, and I know people who exemplify this, who live a simple life here in the middle of San Francisco. They just don't have a lot of stuff, they don't feel like they have to kind of keep owning stuff. They keep it to the bare minimum. And I'm not even suggesting that we all have to go to that extreme, but there's a little something that every single one of us in this room for sure can do that just moves us in the direction of, again, fundamentally not responding to that urge to keep kind of feeling good, and just letting a little bit of like, okay, this feels a bit uncomfortable to not have, my iPod or, whatever it is, or to not go shopping today, but I'm going to see if I can just sit with that little bit of discomfort instead of feeding the urge to be happy.
That's all we have time for the formal part of the meeting. Will you be available for a few minutes
Sure.
after? Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Announcements.
I have a printout for the directory. There's about 40 names on it. And I'm going to leave it on the desk just to the left of the exit door. And you can look at it to see if your name is on it and if the information is correct. And if your name is not on it and you want it to be, there's some blank sheets of paper where you can put the information down. Name, street address, phone number, email address, and any service that you might offer, like Macintosh support, repairs bicycles, health massage, as much or as little information as you want to leave.
Well, the steering committee is meeting today at 12:30, and one of the main topics is the finances of GBF, because we're in the unusual position of having a surplus. Really, we're going to discuss about the finances, and everyone's welcome to come. It's going to be upstairs.
Where upstairs?
Well, there's a room on the second floor. You can enter through the stairway here.
So not going outside, but
Yeah, you can. Yeah, you just enter right here.
Carl?
I just learned that May 20th and 21st is the Himalayan Fair in North Berkeley at Live Oak Park. If anybody's interested.
Okay. Can you lead us in a closing? We usually stand and hold our hand.
Yeah. So just say a few lines of dedicating the merit, and just, again, this is just one of those moments when things aren't necessarily the way we want them to be, so just giving some space for that. May the merit gained in our acting thus go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.